The disturbing mystery of the feral mountain man who locked travelers in his cellar. That's what they whispered in the Appalachian Mountains of Virginia. 1886. 25 women travelers had vanished without a trace. When Ara arrived searching for her missing daughter, she found something that chilled her to the bone. A hidden cellar beneath an ancient oak tree. Inside, the metallic scent of death on the dirt floor. Her daughter's silver locket. The townspeople pointed their fingers at Silas, the wild mountain hermit, who lived like an animal in the woods. But when confronted him in his cabin, expecting to face a monster, she discovered something far more terrifying than she could have imagined. The truth wasn't what it seemed, and the real evil wasn't hiding in the wilderness. It was walking among them, trusted and respected. What happens when the person everyone believes is the monster turns out to be the only one telling the truth? The winter of 1886 settled over the Appalachian Mountains of Virginia like a funeral shroud, its bitter winds carrying whispers of things better left unspoken. Ara Hayes stepped from the rattling stagecoach into the muddy streets of Cedar Hollow, her leather satchel clutched tight against her chest, her breath forming ghostly clouds in the frigid air. The townspeople who bothered to glance her way did so with the suspicious eyes of those who had long ago learned that outsiders brought nothing but trouble to their insular world. She had told them she was a botanist, come to study the unique flora that thrived in these harsh mountain conditions. It was not entirely a lie. She did possess the credentials, the knowledge, the trained eye for the delicate ecosystems that flourished in isolation, but the pressed flowers and scientific journals in her bag were merely props in a more desperate performance. Ara had come for Lily, her 19-year-old daughter, the adventurous artist and fellow botanist who had vanished into these mountains 2 months prior. Like morning mist dissolving into nothingness, the boarding house where she took lodgings smelled of lye soap and resignation. Mrs. Whitmore, the proprietress, was a woman whose face had been carved by years of mountain winters and harder truths. She eyed Ara with the practiced weariness of someone who had seen too many strangers come seeking what could not be found. When Ara mentioned she was looking for her daughter, a young woman who had been sketching the local flora, Mrs. Whitmore's expression shifted to something that might have been pity had it not been so carefully guarded. "Lot of folks come through here," she said, her voice flat as hammered tin. "Mountains don't give up their secrets easy. Your girl, she probably just got turned around. Happens more than you'd think." But Ara had read Lily's last letter 100 times. Memorized every word of her daughter's observations about the stark beauty of the region, the unsettling quiet that seemed to press against the soul like a physical weight. Lily had been experienced in wilderness travel, cautious despite her artistic temperament. She would not have simply gotten lost. The local sheriff, a man named Garrett, whose weathered face spoke of too many years wrestling with problems that had no clean solutions, received Ara's concerns with the tired patience of someone who had heard such pleas before. His office was cramped and dimly lit, dominated by a massive desk scarred by decades of use. Behind him, a wall map of the region was dotted with small red pins, each one marking a place where hope had died. "Ma'am," Sheriff Garrett said, leaning back in his creaking chair, "I understand your worry. I surely do. But these mountains, they're not forgiving to those who don't know their ways. Every year, we get folks, mostly women, traveling alone, artists and such, who think they can just wander off the marked trails with nothing but good intentions and a sketch pad." He gestured to a ledger thick with entries, its pages yellowed and worn. "I got a list here going back 10 years. Missing travelers, most of them young ladies just like your daughter. Mountains took them all, I reckon. Rock slides, falls, exposure, wild animals. It's not personal, it's just the way of things up here." Ara felt something cold settle in her chest, something that had nothing to do with the winter air seeping through the office's single window. 10 years' worth?" she asked quietly. The sheriff's eyes flickered just for a moment before resuming their practiced indifference. "Like I said, mountains don't forgive mistakes." But when she pressed him for details about the searches, about the specific locations where these women had last been seen, his answers became vague, evasive. The investigations had been thorough, he assured her, but the wilderness was vast and unforgiving. Bodies were rarely recovered in such terrain. Families eventually accepted the inevitable and moved on. It was the natural order of things. That evening, alone in her small rented room, Ara spread Lily's letters across the narrow bed and read them again by lamplight. Her daughter's words painted a picture of a landscape both beautiful and somehow wrong, a place where silence pressed too heavy and the very air seemed to hold its breath. In the margins of her botanical sketches, Lily had noted the peculiar absence of birdsong in certain areas, the way shadows seemed to linger longer than they should. It was while going through Lily's abandoned belongings, retrieved from the same boarding house where Ara now stayed, that she made the discovery that would change everything. Hidden beneath the false bottom of Lily's wooden sketchbox, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect it from moisture, was a journal Ara had never seen before. Her hands trembled as she opened it, revealing pages filled with her daughter's familiar handwriting and detailed botanical illustrations, but scattered throughout the scientific observations were drawings of a different nature entirely. Sketches of a crude, isolated cabin nestled deep in a hollow between ridges. Studies of a gaunt, bearded man with eyes that seemed to hold depths of sorrow and wildness in equal measure. Lily had labeled him simply the Mountain Man, and her notes spoke of watching him from a distance, fascinated and disturbed by his feral appearance and strange behavior. One entry dated just days before Lily's disappearance made Ara's blood run cold. Her daughter had discovered a hidden cellar beneath an ancient oak tree near the man's cabin, concealed by branches and forest debris. The final sketch showed the entrance to this underground chamber with detailed notes about its location relative to distinctive rock formations and a peculiar dead tree shaped like a twisted hand reaching toward the sky. As snow began to fall outside her window, Ara carefully folded the journal and tucked it inside her coat. The official investigation may have accepted Lily's disappearance as another tragic accident, but her daughter had left her a map. Whatever had happened to Lily, whatever was happening to all these missing women, the answers lay hidden in that cellar beneath the Mountain Man's domain. The next morning would bring her face to face with whatever truth lurked in those dark hollows. But tonight she sat vigil with her daughter's words, feeling the weight of maternal intuition settling like stone in her chest. She was walking towards something far more sinister than a simple case of a lost traveler, something that had been feeding on the silence and willful blindness of this isolated community for far too long. Outside, the wind howled through the mountain passes like the voices of the forgotten, calling her deeper into the heart of a mystery that would test everything she thought she knew about the nature of evil and the price of truth. Dawn broke grey and reluctant over the mountain ridges as Ara set out from Cedar Hollow. Lily's journal pressed against her ribs beneath her heavy wool coat. The temperature had dropped during the night, turning the muddy streets into treacherous sheets of ice that crunched beneath her boots with each careful step. She had told Mrs. Whitmore she was going on a botanical expedition, another lie wrapped in the threadbare cloth of her supposed profession, and the woman had merely nodded with the resigned expression of someone who had long ago stopped trying to talk sense into fools. The path Lily had mapped in her sketches led away from the main trails, winding through dense stands of bare hickory and oak that seemed to close in around Ara like skeletal fingers. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional crack of settling ice or the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Even the wind seemed muted here, as if the very air had grown thick with secrets too heavy to carry. It took her nearly 3 hours of hard climbing to reach the hollow Lily had described, her breath coming in sharp bursts that crystallized instantly in the frigid air. When she finally crested the ridge and looked down into the narrow valley below, her heart hammered against her ribs with a mixture of triumph and dread. There, exactly as her daughter had drawn it, stood the ramshackle cabin. The structure looked as if it had grown from the mountain itself, its weathered logs grey with age and decay, the roof sagging under the weight of accumulated snow and neglect. Smoke rose from a crooked chimney, a thin grey thread that spoke of habitation, of someone living in this God-forsaken place by choice or necessity. Behind the cabin, its massive trunk, twisted with age and scarred by lightning, stood the ancient oak tree from Lily's final sketch. Ara approached with the caution of a woman who understood she was walking into the heart of something she might not survive. The cabin appeared deserted from the outside, its single window dark and shuttered, but the smoke from the chimney meant someone was inside watching, waiting. She circled the structure once, her scientific mind cataloguing details, even as her mother's heart screamed warnings she chose to ignore. The oak tree dominated the small clearing behind the cabin, like a monument to some forgotten tragedy. Its trunk was easily 8 feet across, its gnarled roots spreading in all directions to create a network of natural hiding places. Ara found herself following Lily's footsteps, searching for the telltale signs her daughter had noted in her journal, the depression in the earth, the careful arrangement of branches that seemed too deliberate to be natural. When she found the cellar entrance, her hands shook so violently she could barely clear away the concealing debris. The wooden door was heavy, swollen with moisture and age, and it took all her strength to pry it open far enough to peer inside. The smell that rose from the darkness below hit her like a physical blow, damp earth and something else, something metallic and wrong that made her stomach clench with instinctive revulsion. She had brought a small lantern, and by its flickering light she descended into the underground chamber. The space was larger than she had expected, carved from the living rock and reinforced with rough-hewn timbers that gleamed with moisture. The floor was packed earth, and scattered across its surface were objects that made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. There, half buried in the dirt near the far wall, was the silver locket she had given Lily for her 18th birthday. The delicate chain was broken, the oval pendant tarnished but unmistakable. Ara fell to her knees and clutched it to her chest, the metal cold against her palm, and for a moment the grief threatened to drown her entirely. Her daughter had been here in this terrible place, and now she was gone, but even as the sobs tore from her throat, her scientific mind continued to work, cataloguing details that would have meant nothing to a casual observer. The cellar was too clean, too empty for a place that had held a captive. There were no restraints, no evidence of struggle, no signs of the violence she had expected to find. Instead, there was something almost reverent about the space, as if it had been used for a purpose entirely different from what she had imagined. When she finally emerged from the cellar, her face streaked with tears and dirt, she found herself no longer alone. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, tall and lean as a scarecrow, watching her with eyes that held depths of sorrow she could feel across the distance between them. This was the mountain man from Lily's sketches, the wild hermit the townspeople whispered about in fearful tones. But the man who approached her was not the monster she had expected. His clothes were rough and patched but clean, his hair and beard unkempt, but not wild with madness. When he spoke, his voice was soft and careful, as if he were unused to human conversation, but still remembered how it was supposed to work. "You found it," he said, and there was no surprise in his voice, only a bone-deep weariness that seemed to weigh down his every word. "I wondered when someone would come looking." Ara stood slowly, the locket still clutched in her fist, and faced him across the frozen ground. "Where is she?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where is my daughter?" The man's eyes closed for a moment, and when he opened them again, she saw something in their depths that chilled her more than the mountain wind ever could. "Come with me," he said. "There's something you need to see, something you need to understand before you judge what you think you know." He turned and walked deeper into the forest, moving with the sure-footed grace of someone who had spent his entire life navigating these treacherous slopes. Ara hesitated for only a moment before following, driven by a need that transcended fear or caution. Whatever truth waited for her in these dark woods, whatever horror or revelation lay ahead, she would face it. She owed her daughter that much, and she owed it to herself. The path he led her down was barely visible, winding between massive boulders and through stands of evergreen that blocked out what little sunlight remained. As they walked, the silence seemed to grow heavier, pressing against them like a living thing, and Ara began to understand why Lily had written about the unsettling quiet of these mountains. It was the silence of secrets, of things buried so deep they had ceased to exist for the world above. When they finally stopped, it was before what looked like nothing more than a crack in the mountainside, a narrow opening between two massive slabs of granite that seemed to lead into the very heart of the earth itself. The mountain man turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw a reflection of her own grief, magnified and deepened by years of carrying burdens no human soul was meant to bear. The revelation that her daughter was truly gone hit Ara with the force of an avalanche, but it was the discovery of what lay beneath Cedar Hollow's carefully maintained facade of ignorance that transformed her grief into something far more dangerous. She returned from the mountain cave with Silas's terrible truth burning in her chest like swallowed fire, carrying knowledge that would either destroy her or forge her into an instrument of justice the town had never seen before. In the weeks that followed, Ara threw herself into research with the methodical precision of a scientist dissecting a specimen. Only now her subject was not the delicate flora of the Appalachian Mountains, but the systematic disappearance of women who had dared to travel alone through these seemingly peaceful hollows. She commandeered a corner table at the town's only tavern, spreading out maps and notebooks with a quiet intensity that made the locals give her a wide berth, their conversations dropping to uncomfortable whispers whenever she entered a room. The official records were maddeningly incomplete, filled with gaps and inconsistencies that spoke of either profound incompetence or deliberate obfuscation. Sheriff Garrett's ledger, which she had glimpsed during their first meeting, contained only the barest details about each disappearance. Names, dates, last known locations, scrawled in hasty handwriting that suggested a man more interested in closing cases than solving them. But Ara possessed something the sheriff lacked: the patience of a mother seeking truth and the analytical skills of a woman trained to see patterns others missed. She began with the town's newspaper archives, dusty editions of the Cedar Hollow Gazette dating back 15 years, their yellowed pages filled with the mundane details of rural life, harvest reports, social gatherings, births and deaths recorded with the stilted prose of small-town journalism. What she found, buried between advertisements for patent medicines and announcements of church socials, was a pattern so subtle it had escaped notice for over a decade. Every 18 to 24 months without fail, there appeared a brief notice about a missing traveler. Always a woman, always traveling alone, always described as an artist or writer or naturalist drawn to the region's rugged beauty. The notices were remarkably similar in their phrasing, each one expressing confidence that the missing person would soon be found safe, that the mountains occasionally claimed the unwary, but rarely the dead. What made Ara's blood run cold was the realization that no follow-up stories ever appeared. These women simply vanished from the public record as completely as they had vanished from the world. Her investigation might have ended there, stalled by the wall of silence that seemed to surround these disappearances like morning fog. But fate delivered her an unlikely ally in the form of Deputy Thomas Morrison. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 25 or 26, with the earnest face of a man who had entered law enforcement believing he could make a difference, and had not yet been entirely crushed by the reality of what that meant in a place like Cedar Hollow. She encountered him by accident, or what she later came to believe was providence, when she stumbled while leaving the newspaper office with her arms full of copied records. The deputy helped her gather the scattered papers, and she saw him pause over one of the missing person notices, his face growing pale as he read the name printed there. "Sarah Morrison," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the wind rattling the storefront windows. "She was my sister." That evening, in the back room of Morrison's modest boarding-house quarters, Ara learned the true scope of the horror that had been festering in Cedar Hollow for more than a decade. Sarah Morrison had vanished 3 years earlier while on a sketching expedition, much like Lily, much like all the others. Deputy Morrison had been the one to file the missing person report, the one to organize search parties that found nothing but abandoned campsites and scattered belongings that suggested hasty departures rather than foul play. "I never believed the official story," Morrison confided, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had grown cold hours earlier. Sarah knew these mountains better than anyone. She'd been climbing them since she was old enough to walk. She wouldn't have just gotten lost or fallen prey to some accident. But every time I tried to push for a more thorough investigation, Sheriff Garrett shut me down, said I was too close to the case, too emotional to think clearly. Together, they began to piece together a more complete picture of the disappearances, cross-referencing the newspaper notices with Morrison, S. own carefully maintained files, and Ara, S. scientific approach to pattern recognition. What emerged was a systematic horror that had been hiding in plain sight for over 15 years. The missing women were not random victims of an unforgiving wilderness, but carefully selected targets chosen for their isolation, their independence, their lack of local connections that would make their disappearances difficult to dismiss or ignore. More disturbing still was the discovery that several of the women had been seen in town shortly before their disappearances, not by random townspeople, but by specific individuals who seemed to appear in connection with multiple cases. Dr. Marcus Holloway's name surfaced again and again in the fragmentary records, always in the context of treating minor injuries or ailments that had brought the women to his office in their final days. He examined Sarah the day before she disappeared, Morrison revealed, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. Said she had complained of headaches, that he'd given her something to help her sleep. I thought nothing of it at the time. Sarah did suffer from headaches when she was overtired, but now, looking at the pattern, Dr. Holloway was Cedar Hollow's most respected citizen, a man who had delivered half the babies in town and tended to 3 generations of families with apparent dedication and skill. His medical practice was the closest thing to modern healthcare the isolated community possessed, and his word on matters of life and death carried the weight of absolute authority. The idea that such a pillar of respectability could be connected to the systematic murder of young women was so fundamentally at odds with everything the town believed about itself that Ara understood why the truth had remained hidden for so long. But as she and Morrison dug deeper into the doctor's background, cross-referencing his movements with the timeline of disappearances and examining the curious frequency with which he had pronounced the earlier deaths as accidents, a more sinister picture began to emerge. Dr. Holloway possessed not only the medical knowledge to kill without leaving obvious traces, but also the social position to deflect suspicion and the professional authority to declare deaths accidental without fear of contradiction. The breakthrough came when Morrison managed to locate the original police reports from some of the earliest disappearances documents that had been filed away in a basement storage room and forgotten by everyone except the young deputy whose sister had become part of the pattern. The reports contained details that had never made it into the official ledger, witness statements, and physical evidence that painted a picture of systematic predation rather than random tragedy. 3 separate witnesses had reported seeing Dr. Holloway's distinctive black medical bag near the sites where women had last been seen alive. In 2 cases, the doctor had been the one to discover the abandoned campsites, always with an explanation about being in the area to gather medicinal herbs or visit a distant patient. His concern had seemed genuine, his efforts to organize search parties beyond reproach, but the pattern was unmistakable once seen clearly. The weight of their discoveries pressed down on Ara like the mountain snow, heavy and cold and suffocating. They were not dealing with a random killer or even a crime of passion, but with something far more calculated and infinitely more dangerous. A predator who had woven himself so deeply into the fabric of the community that exposing him would require dismantling the very foundations of trust upon which Cedar Hollow had built its identity. The confrontation came on a morning when the mountain mist hung so thick it seemed to muffle the very heartbeat of the world, transforming Cedar Hollow into a ghost town where shadows moved like memories and truth felt as distant as summer warmth. Ara had spent 3 sleepless nights wrestling with the knowledge that Deputy Morrison's evidence could destroy Dr. Holloway. But she also knew that accusations without absolute proof would only drive the killer deeper underground, perhaps to emerge in some other unsuspecting community where young women would continue to disappear without explanation. She found Silas waiting for her at the edge of town, his gaunt frame materializing from the fog like a spectre of conscience come to guide her toward a reckoning she could no longer postpone. The mountain man had become her unlikely confessor during the weeks since their first meeting, the one person in Cedar Hollow who understood the weight of carrying knowledge that could either damn or deliver an entire community from its willful blindness. "You're going to see him," Silas said, and it was not a question but a statement delivered with the flat certainty of a man who had long ago learned to read the intentions written in human faces. "You think you're ready for what that means?" Ara adjusted her grip on the leather satchel that contained copies of every document Morrison had helped her gather, every newspaper clipping and witness statement and official report that painted the picture of Dr. Holloway's methodical predation. "I have to know," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I have to hear it from his own mouth, or I'll spend the rest of my life wondering if we got it wrong." The walk to Dr. Holloway's residence took them through the heart of Cedar Hollow, past the whitewashed church where 3 generations of families had brought their children for baptism, past the general store where mothers discussed their domestic concerns in hushed tones that suggested a world fundamentally safe and predictable. The normalcy of it all made Ara's discovery feel even more surreal, as if she had stumbled into some parallel universe where monsters wore the faces of healers and evil flourished beneath the protection of respectability. Dr. Holloway's house stood at the end of Elm Street, a 2-story structure painted a cheerful yellow with green shutters and a wraparound porch that spoke of prosperity earned through years of dedicated service to the community. The morning glory vines that climbed the porch columns were brown and dormant in the winter cold, but Ara could imagine how welcoming the place would look in summer. How many patients had climbed those front steps, seeking relief from their ailments, never suspecting they were entering the domain of a man who found healing less interesting than the precise application of death. She knocked on the front door with a hand that trembled despite her efforts at composure, and when Dr. Holloway answered, she was struck by how utterly ordinary he appeared. He was a man of medium height and unremarkable features, his greying hair neatly combed, and his clothes well maintained but not ostentatious. His eyes, when they met hers, held the practiced warmth of a physician accustomed to putting nervous patients at ease. And for a moment she wondered if Morrison's suspicions had led them down a path of terrible error. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice carrying the gentle authority that had no doubt soothed countless worried mothers and frightened children over the years. "I was so sorry to hear about your daughter. Such a tragedy when someone so young is taken by the wilderness. Please come in. Perhaps there's something I can do to help ease your grief." The interior of the house was as carefully maintained as its exterior, filled with the accumulated treasures of a man who had spent decades earning the trust and gratitude of his neighbors. Medical texts lined the shelves of his study, their leather bindings worn smooth by countless consultations, and framed certificates on the walls testified to his credentials and professional standing. It was the home of a healer, a place where suffering was supposed to find relief, and the disconnect between appearance and reality made Ara feel as if she were drowning in some nightmare version of normalcy. Dr. Holloway poured her tea from a delicate china service, his movements precise and practiced, and settled into the chair across from her with the patient attention of a man accustomed to listening to the troubles of others. When she began to speak about Lily's disappearance, about the pattern of missing women she had uncovered in her research, his expression remained one of sympathetic concern, touched with what appeared to be genuine sorrow for the losses that had befallen so many families over the years. "I'm afraid you are not the first grieving parent to search for meaning in what is ultimately the random cruelty of nature," he said, his voice carrying the weight of professional experience with such tragedies. "The human mind seeks patterns even where none exist, particularly when we're confronted with losses that seem too arbitrary to accept. Your daughter was a lovely young woman with her whole life ahead of her. I understand the need to believe that her death must have some greater significance than simple misfortune." But when Ara began to recite the specific details Morrison had helped her uncover, the frequency of Dr. Holloway's presence at the discovery sites, the consistent pattern of his medical examinations preceding the disappearances, the curious gaps in the official records that seemed designed to obscure rather than illuminate, something subtle shifted in the doctor's demeanor. The practiced warmth in his eyes gave way to a cooler assessment, and his hands, which had been resting casually on the arms of his chair, tightened almost imperceptibly. "You've been very thorough in your research," he said finally, and there was something in his tone that made the hair on the back of Ara's neck stand on end. "Deputy Morrison has been quite helpful, I imagine. Such a dedicated young man, though perhaps not always as discreet as his position requires." The admission hung between them like smoke from an extinguished candle, carrying with it the acrid scent of truth finally exposed to light. Dr. Holloway rose from his chair with the careful movements of a man who had suddenly found himself in unfamiliar territory, and when he turned to face her again, the mask of beneficent authority had slipped just enough to reveal something cold and calculating beneath. "They were so beautiful," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Each one of them possessed something that was going to be lost to time, to age, to the inevitable degradation that comes to all living things. I simply found a way to preserve what would otherwise have been wasted." The confession spilled from him with the relief of a man who had carried the weight of his secrets for far too long, and Ara realized with horror that part of him was actually grateful for the opportunity to finally speak about what he considered his life's work. He described his methods with the clinical detachment of a scientist discussing an experiment, explaining how he had used his medical knowledge to create deaths that appeared accidental, how he had positioned himself to discover the bodies and perform the examinations that would ensure no one questioned the official verdicts of misadventure. "Your daughter was particularly gifted," he continued, seemingly oblivious to the way Ara had gone rigid with shock and revulsion. Her artistic sensibilities, her appreciation for natural beauty, she understood in those final moments what I was trying to achieve. The locket was her idea, actually. She said it would help her remember who she had been before she became something eternal. The lie was so monstrous, so perfectly calculated to inflict maximum psychological damage, that Ara felt something break inside her chest, like a dam bursting under unbearable pressure. The grief she had been carrying transformed in that instant into something far more dangerous. A rage so pure and focused it seemed to burn away everything else until only the need for justice remained.